Had to tell myself this morning that I got to stay focused because I'm not sure how long this lesson's going to go. So, all right, good morning. It's good to see everybody. We are in starting a new series today at the Parables of Jesus. This is week 1, and the title of this week is called Knowing My Father. Probably should really be the title of this particular parable, but we all know it as the parable of the prodigal son. And so as we move through this, we're going to find out why that is. If you're watching online, glad to have you with us this morning or this evening or sometime next week, whenever it is that you watch it. If you need copies of the notes that are passed out, you can email us info@warrentonchristian.org. info@warrentonchristian.org, and I'll be glad to get those to you. I want to give just a little bit of an introduction this morning to the series, and then we're going to dive into this first parable. Interestingly enough, a truly great story or a drama of any kind, anytime we go and see a movie, we go and see a play, a musical, whatever it is, if it's truly great, it allows us to see ourselves in one or more of the characters. In other words, we can suddenly relate to an individual inside that. It draws us in as we begin to empathize with those characters. We begin to have self-recognition, kind of like we're looking in a mirror. And then once we recognize ourselves, we have self-understanding of the situation that they're in, the surroundings. But mostly we understand what the implications of the story are, okay? And so when we read the parables of Jesus, most of them, not all, but most of them, it should produce in us a self-recognition and a self-understanding. In other words, it should do the same thing. It should allow us to look at it and go, oh, that character is me. I can identify with that character. Not only are the parables a window into our heart, but the parables really are a window into the heart and the soul of God the Father. And that's, I truly believe, after having begun this study and reading, that I'm picking up on this and going, wow, this is a whole new viewpoint of these. The parables, they help us to know who God is. They help us to recognize a divine solution to our problem. It's not just, hey, here's the problem and here's how these guys solved it. It becomes a divine solution to that problem. Parables bring encouragement because not only do we recognize the problem, but Jesus gave us the solution as well on every parable. Now, here are 3 general comments that we need to keep in mind as we study, okay? Let me see. You don't have to agree with these. This is how the angle that I'm coming from, okay? First of all, the parables are not isolated stories. In other words, these are not stories that were unique to Jesus' time and it's the only person that this ever happened to. Think about this. The parables were always told to answer a question or to address a particular situation. And if that's true, therefore, it becomes important to study the context of the parable to truly understand it. Okay? Secondly, the parables are not allegories. Allegories are something that points to something else. In other words, so oftentimes the parable of the lost sheep. Okay? The allegory, when you look at it, is that, oh, Jesus is talking about the lost Christian. Okay? But most of the parables are not truly allegories. Although the details may have some symbolic significance, the parable is designed to teach only one point. In other words, in the lost sheep, you know, the sheep is the church and Jesus is the shepherd, right? The wolf, you know, all of those things have different meanings. No, from where I'm going to come from on this study is designed to teach one point and one point only, okay? And then the third thing, and I found this really interesting because I think we should tell ourselves this on every time we study the Bible, but it really hit me on as I studied the parables here. It says we need to consciously leave our 21st century Western world. Jesus' parables draw on the first century world of Palestine. As one author said, to seek him properly, we need to smell the aroma of Jewish villages and feel the dust of the Galilean roads. And man, I read that and I was like, you know what? That's right. We need to, if we truly want to understand, we need to What was it like in Palestine? That's why you hear me so often talk about context. Context is so important. Who was he talking to? What was going on in the world at the time? Okay? He finishes this little introduction, or I should say I finished this introduction with a quote from Gary Enrig. And this is the book that I'm using. It's called The Parables, Understanding What Jesus Meant by Gary Enrig. And it's really, really good. But he says this. He says, familiarity breeds contempt. But really, in our world today, familiarity breeds complacency. When we get familiar with something, we get complacent with it, right? Because we think we know these stories, we do not really listen to them. And he says, I challenge you over the next 12 weeks to read, listen, and hear these parables as if you're hearing them for the very first time. Okay? And I can truly say, as I read this and I was studying this, I was like, well, that's not how I understood it. Well, that's not how I thought it, what it meant, or how I've been taught what it meant. Okay? So that kind of gives us an introduction. This lesson is called Knowing My Father, which, as I said at the beginning, really makes me wonder if that's really what the parable should be called, the parable of knowing my Father. A.W. Tozer, who was a Christian scholar, he begins his masterly study of the character of God, which is called The Knowledge of the Holy. He has this provocative sentence that he opens the book with, and he says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing to us. Now think about that for a second. What comes into our minds when we think about God, it's the most important thing for us. The agenda of modern secular man has little place for God. They don't think about God, the secular individual in general, okay? What I think about God is important. In fact, those other questions can only be answered in the light of who he is and what he says, okay? But it creates a dilemma. And I love the way Gary wrote this, and I kept the quote exact. It says, in the theological cafeteria of the 20th century, we should say the 21st century now, which God should I choose? Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. A theological cafeteria. In other words, you have all kinds of choices. You don't like what they're teaching, you can go somewhere else. You don't like the music, you can go somewhere else. You don't like the people, you can go somewhere else. Which God should I choose? Or, he says, should I build my own God a la carte? Combining ideas that seem to me to be palatable and appealing. From where do I get my understanding of God? Okay? Now, Jesus, over and over and over, Jesus tried to scrape away the understanding, the misinformation, and the misunderstanding that obstructed people's view of God the Father. Think about that. They had not seen or heard from God, anybody, for 400 years before Jesus comes, right? Prior to that, it was only certain prophets that would hear from God. For 1,000 years before that, it was Moses to see God, or see the afterburner, or whatever it was, right? So this picture of God the Father had been misconstrued and changed and added to and changed around. And Jesus tried to scrape away that misinformation and misunderstanding. But he also makes it clear that knowledge of God is not equivalent to theological orthodoxy. In other words, just because you know God doesn't make you a Christian. All right? The evidence that we know God is not so much our ability to define the divine attributes as it is our response to people. Now, think about that one for a minute. The evidence that we know God is not so much our ability to define the divine attributes as it is our response to people. Makes me immediately think of the passage of Scripture that says, faith without works is dead. I can believe God. I can believe in God, but if I don't do anything with that faith, right?
It makes me think of, how can you love God whom you have not seen? You don't love a brother whom you have seen.
Yeah.
You know, your response to people.
That's exactly right.
And then there's that other passage where he says, if you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me.
Yes. Yeah, all of those begin to tie in, and you begin to understand, okay, now it makes sense. Just because we can tell you who God is and what he expects from you doesn't, and we don't treat people right, who's that a picture of? First century Palestine, it's a picture of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know all about God. We know the law. We know what's supposed to happen, right? And yet they treated people terrible. Right knowledge of God is present when we imitate our Father's response. It's in fact the parable of the Father's heart, which is recorded in Luke 15. And that's where we're going to be today, in Luke 15. So we start this, again, by giving a little bit of context. There's this question that comes up about the Lord's disreputable companions. Man, look at the company this guy is keeping. To appreciate the story, it's important that we see the events that were happening right before Jesus told this so that we understand why he told it. So we begin in Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Okay? Jesus shocked his contemporaries. Jesus was just like this guy out of the, I don't even know how to say it, out of left field that is hitting the Pharisees and the Sadducees. His words and his actions constantly offended the religious and the self-righteous. And I suspect that his behavior would have made many of us uncomfortable as well. Okay? But in Jesus' time, we need to understand this. Tax collectors weren't only unpopular, they were agents of the Roman oppressor. They were pariahs. In other words, they were, how do you let me think about this a second. They weren't just picked to be in those spots. It's hard for us to understand because we're a free country, right? Let's take for a minute, let's assume we lost World War II, okay? And we are now controlled by the Germans, all right? And suddenly, there's some Americans who are being picked to collect taxes for the Germans. That's the same analogy. Go ahead, Aaron.
What you're looking for, I think, is shill.
Shill?
Yeah, like somebody planted inside of a community to...
That's a new one. I'll start using that in my vocabulary now. Yeah, but yes, that's exactly what it is. Somebody who is part of that community, but not really part of that community. They've kind of defected over, and they're now doing the bidding for those who are in charge. Here was the thing. In Rome, I mean, our system of taxation here in America makes the corruption prevalent on the taxpayer's side of the thing. But in Rome, it was corrupt on the tax collector's side. Okay, so the Romans said, I need you to collect $10,000 this week. Okay, anything you collect above that, you can keep. So the tax collector went out and figured, I got 1,000 people, that'd be $1,000 each. So I'm going to charge them $1,100 each, and I'll get myself $1,000. That was how that worked. Okay. Because they dealt so often with the Gentiles, the tax collectors were also considered religiously unclean. And so to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish people, they could only regard these people as disloyal, dishonest, and disreputable. In other words, you're not only turned your back on us, now you're unclean as well. Okay? Being unclean is another picture that we can't, I don't think we as Americans picture that in our head because we don't have anything like that relates to that. Okay? In my days in the Catholic Church, if they didn't call it unclean, but you haven't been to church in forever and you haven't gone to confession, man, you're in big trouble, right? But that doesn't even really come close to describing how that picture was for them. So the tax collectors, they were indifferent to religion, but such people were not indifferent to spiritual truth. Even the Gentiles were the same way. They didn't necessarily have a religion, but they understood spiritual truths. They were drawn to Jesus' teaching. a fact that just, it infuriated the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They would go crazy. Men who represented the high point of religion and respectability in Jewish life. So the problem was not so much sinful people's response to the Lord, but it was really the Lord's response to them. After all, who will it object if a sinner came to learn? If a sinner shows up, who are we to object that they've come to learn? As long as they know their place, right? You know, the homeless drug addict that shows up at church on Sunday morning that hasn't showered in days. You know, everybody, we try and welcome them in, but man, make sure they sit somewhere that, does that make sense to you? Those are the things that started going through my mind. Now, we've not experienced anything like that, and I think our church, God has blessed us with an outpouring of friendliness. In fact, Bill used to describe it. He would invite people. Sometimes I'm a little nervous about inviting people because they're kind of like the little fish that gets thrown in the fish tank of piranha. You walk in the front door and everybody says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. Hi, hey, welcome here. Hey, can we get you here?" You know, sometimes they feel attacked because of that, okay? But again, this was the feeling that they had in a culture where sharing a meal meant acceptance and approval. That was the Jewish culture back then. If you shared a meal, you were accepted and you were approved. How could a good man behave like this? How could he enjoy their company and have them enjoy his? That tells us all that we need to know about Jesus. That's what the Pharisees said. You can tell a man by the company he keeps, and since he's not with good people, he's obviously not a good man. Right? That was their thought process. Not everybody who follows Jesus is our kind of person. It's the prejudice that Jesus saw, and it's precisely this prejudice that leads to what follows. Then Jesus told them this parable. But it wasn't just one parable. He tells them three parables. He tells them a parable about the lost sheep, then he tells them a parable about the lost coin, and then the lost son. And each parable he addresses to the self-righteous Pharisees. He puts a mirror in front of them and a window next to that, and that window is open into heaven. And they, in fact, know far less about themselves and about God than they think they do. And he shows that very clearly. How can we say we know God if we do not know what gives him pain and brings him joy? The comment you made about knowing God if I don't know my brother. That's it. How can we say we know God if we don't know what gives God pain and what brings him joy? The Lord Jesus wants us to see that the Father's heart hurts for the lost and it rejoices when the lost are found. That's the backing of those stories there. And it's obvious that we as people feel that way. The amazing discovery is that God feels that way also. That's the point of the parables. They tell us not so much about the lost sheep or about the seeking shepherd or the lost coin or the searching. Get myself all excited here as I get into this. They tell us not about the lost sheep as much as they tell us about the seeking shepherd. Not about the lost coin as much as they tell us about the woman who's searching. And again, with the parable we're going to look at, not so much about the lost son as the loving Father. And all of these speak about our Father in heaven. Which really, this is one story that's told in two parts. This is an important observation that is often ignored. We think that's one parable, but it's really kind of two. And we're going to look at that. Jesus' story doesn't end with the return of the lost son, or Jesus' story, doesn't end with the return of the prodigal, but with the appeal to the older brother. And it's in the last half of the parable that we're going to find a really powerful application, and one that's really intended for the scribes and the Pharisees. Okay? So here's Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 24. Let's read this, and then we're going to jump into this. I know that felt like a long introduction, but I think we needed to understand some of that. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had two sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." Now, I don't remember ever having lost one of my kids. Like when we were shopping or out and about. I kind of vaguely remember moments where I was like, "Oh, where'd they go?" You know, where you kind of do that searching, but not like where we had to get everybody searching, okay? I do recall being on an event, on an outing with the Scouts years ago. We were at somebody's place, in fact, south of town here, down off of Shoots and Ground Road. They had big, huge cliffs, and we were teaching the boys how to rock climb and rappel. And several of the people had brought their families with them. And I recall having to stop because this one little boy got lost. He was probably about 4 years old. Okay, so the whole thing was you would go around and follow the path up to the top, step into the woods, put your harness on, rappel down, and you would do that over and over. Well, this little boy followed his brother and went up and didn't realize his brother stepped off the path, and so he just kept following the path. Well, we didn't know it. So there was probably about 45 or 50 of us there. We fanned out and went and found him, but his parents were in an absolute panic wanting to know, where's our son? Where is he at? Okay? If you think about that, what can compare with the anguish of a parent's heart over a lost son? There's a horrible panic when an infant vanishes. It's a different but real panic when a grown child wanders morally or spiritually, right? The problem in the latter situation, when they wander at an older age, is that we don't know where they are or what they're doing, but that we do. Okay? We know that oftentimes they're in a far country, not only wasting their money, but wasting their lives. Okay? Let's talk about this leaving of the father's house and how that impacted the people around him. The young man's request to, "Father, give me my inheritance. Give me what's mine." That had to have been a dagger in his father's heart. You see, he didn't just want a loan. He literally wanted his inheritance. If you were to translate that into Jewish Palestine language at that time, basically he says, if you won't hurry up and die, give me what's coming now. I want it and I don't want to wait for it. Hurry up and die. I want what's mine. The Lord wants us to feel the shock of that request. Some experts in Middle Eastern culture tell us that the young man was literally expressing a wish for his father to die. You see, a father could initiate a discussion about inheritance, but never a son. The father could have said, "Son, I've decided I'm going to give you your inheritance now so you can strike out on your own." That would have been acceptable. But for a son to say, "Dad, I want what's mine, my inheritance," that was absolutely unacceptable. Think about this. Sometimes a parent is helpless to prevent a course of life leading to destruction. We all have experienced, or maybe have had somebody that we know experience that. There comes a time where you have to let the prodigal go. And so what does the dad do? He divides his estate with 2/3 going to the older brother and 1/3 to the younger brother. That's what Jewish law required. Okay? But apparently, if we really read close, the father went beyond the usual practice because he distributed not only his capital, but his property. Okay? In other words, the son didn't ooh, that was weird. The son didn't just say, "Give me my inheritance of the cash." He wanted his part of the property as well. okay? And think about it. This was no small matter. It wouldn't be a small matter for us either, right? Because that property represented the old man's security for the future. He was now totally vulnerable. It's not like our kids that come and say, hey, give me my car and give me my inheritance and off I go. Well, if we were to do what it says this man did, then we would go and we would remortgage our property so that we could take a third of that money and give to this young man. Yeah, makes you raise your eyebrows and you're like, oh, all of a sudden, third of your business, everything. And all of a sudden you're like, well, now I'm not quite as comfortable headed into retirement as I thought I was, right? That's literally what that father felt. Now, the young man's determined to be totally independent. So he goes and lives in a far country, right? The text tells us that he got together all he had, and it suggests that he turned all of his assets into ready cash. He sold the property because he intended to cut all of his ties with his past and with his parents. He left behind not only his father's house, but his father's God. Now, a distant country to a Jewish nation, to a Jewish person, that was the Gentiles. Okay? That's literally what that was. It means Gentile country, characterized by pagan values and heathen morals. It takes little imagination to realize how he squandered his wealth in wild living. Okay? You may put that in terms that we understand here. He gathered up, he liquidated everything, took all of his cash, and he headed to the east side. Yeah, everybody here understands. Oh, okay, I got that. I got that picture now, right?
It's on the east side.
Yeah.
Actually, I haven't heard that expression before. I can imagine how he squandered it, but I'm not familiar with that.
Well, East St. Louis is well known for its houses of ill repute and dance houses and so on and so forth. That's why they called it East Side.
Okay.
All right. Maybe it was just a guy thing.
Well, but, so,
Ed understood, right? Ed knew. Ed drove the van full of our youth and turned around in one of their parking lots. By accident, yes. Sooner or later, choices bring... Very possibly. He very possibly would have been. But sooner or later, choices bring consequences, and so the same is true here. The young man runs out of money, and he runs into a famine. And local people hire him to feed the pigs, which for a Jew, it's unthinkable. Literally. But desperation knows no pride, and the young man not only lives with the pigs, but he's willing to eat with them. It's not just a matter of, oh, I'll stay out where the pigs stay. It's, I'm going to eat what they eat. Okay? Now, here's where we get to this looking in the mirror. Okay? There is an insanity to sin, and this boy suddenly himself sees himself as he really is. You know, there's that place, or we pray there's that place, that if our kids ever turn away, that they get to that point where they look in that mirror and they realize, what am I doing? What am I doing? Right? The first step to spiritual sanity is repentance. In other words, a return to a realistic understanding of who God is and who we are. Because oftentimes when we turn away from God, it's because we think we know better. It's because we think we can figure out a better plan than God has for us. We know a better way. But when we truly understand who God is and who we are in relation to Him, well, the young man realized his choices had been sinful, not only against God, but against his father. And he literally says that, and Jesus shares that. In accepting the responsibility for his actions and recognizing the wrong he'd done, he is literally beginning to embrace the truth. But the boy's proposal indicates that while he desires his father's house, he doesn't understand his father's heart. He knows he's forfeited all right to sonship. He knows I can't be the son anymore. The best he can hope for is that maybe my dad will take me back as a servant. He's aware that he can claim nothing more. Okay? There is no harder place to go than where you have failed. Okay? I will never forget the night that our daughter came over to tell us that she was going to ask for a divorce from her husband. She was shaken. It was a place she didn't want to go, but she knew she needed to come tell mom and dad. Okay? There's no harder place to go than where you have failed. And think about this. Villages, small towns, can be cruel places. This boy's actions had probably been the talk of the town, and he knew that going home meant running a gauntlet of criticism and hostility, right? But while the boy is still a long way off, the father sees him. Here's a father who's not only willing to receive his son, he's been looking for him. Day after day, he's been waiting for this moment. Think about this. Only a broken man would run as his son is walking. But the scripture, the parable, Jesus says he was filled with compassion for him. Note the timing. The son is too far away to express his repentance, but already the father's grace is racing towards him. Okay? To understand this story, we need to know this. Older men in the Middle East do not run, even at VBS. Older men do not run. This father was an aged and wealthy landowner. Robes made running difficult, and the concept of dignity made it inappropriate. Think about this. Even in our day and age, important people restrain their emotions publicly. Unless you're at a football game. Then it's kind of, right? Sometimes a baseball game. But hockey game, basketball, yeah. But this father's heart is filled with two things. First, his love for his son and a desire to reach him before any of the judgmental villagers do. That's the one that struck me. I was like, I never thought about that. Never thought about that. And the son begins to pour out his well-rehearsed speech. Father, I have sinned. And he gets no further. That's all the old man needs to hear. He turns to the crowd that's followed and gathered around to watch. He says nothing to his son, but his actions are going to say it all. He turns to his servants. Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. That would have been his festival robe. Okay? That would have been worn on grand occasions. The boy was to be the guest of honor. Put a ring on his finger, not just as an ornament, but as a symbol of authority, and sandals on his feet. Slaves and servants were barefoot. Only the family wore shoes. The father isn't merely clothing his son, he is covering him with honor and acceptance. Bring the fattened calf, the one carefully prepared for a special occasion, and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. Nothing is to be ordinary. I want it to be grand. His prodigal son is to receive the highest honor. Okay? This is an amazing picture of grace. And I think about that, and I think about my journey towards God. I can remember to this day, the day that I decided I need to change directions. And then to picture that, okay, I'm changing directions and I need to go find out more about this Jesus and this God thing than I understood being raised as a Catholic, okay, and my sin and how that affects me. But I can picture God was already running towards me because I had made that decision in my heart. And this is an amazing picture to me. God is not an austere being. He doesn't just impassively dispense justice, right? He does not merely smile upon the good and the righteous. His grace is almost undignified in its exuberance. That's a fancy word in how much it is and how awesome he goes about it. And that's the picture that we get. What this dad was doing for his son. Kill the fattened calf. Bring the robes. Come on, let's have a party. Right? Here's a God who runs and rejoices and embraces. Here's a God who not only accepts the dry cleaned and the sanitized, but he runs headlong towards the filthy, wayward son who has turned his heart towards home. Because you know that boy didn't stop to take a shower on his way home. Right? Here's a God who, as time is going to make clear, gives not only his best robe, but his only son. Here's a God who shouts to the returning rebel, welcome home. This is a God that the Pharisees did not know. And that's why the story doesn't end with verse 24. In fact, this next passage is the key to the entire parable. Verses 25 to 32. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, "Hey, what's going on?" "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. For just a moment, if we do allegorically, if the prodigal son is meant to represent the tax collector and the sinners in verse 1, it is obvious that the older brother is the Lord's portrait of the Pharisees in verse 2. Okay? Certainly the Lord is not criticizing goodness and respectability. The older brother appeared to have a relationship with his father, which in fact he did not have. And the Lord used him to unmask the Pharisees' claims to truly know the Father. The sounds of celebration fall on unsympathetic ears as the elder brother returns home. He hears all this music. I'm not going to sympathize that this guy's back, right? The news he receives confirms his worst suspicions. His brother's return, that good-for-nothing whom he despises, and his father's gone off the deep end in the celebration, right? Now, there's no doubt about the son's duty here. The oldest son should act as his father's special assistant on such occasions and be the co-host. And this brother has no intention of playing that role. The older brother becomes angry and he refuses to go in. This is a very specific insult to his father. Publicly, he makes clear his disapproval of his father's actions, like a teenager picking a fight with his parents before a full house of guests. How many of us have ever experienced that? I can remember that a time or two, where you want to grab them by the arm and yank them over to the side and go, listen, we'll talk about this later. Not now, right? But there's even more here. It says, the son would rather not have fellowship with his father than accept his father's treatment of his brother. Wow. Now let's bring that to what Jesus was talking about. The Pharisees would not have fellowship with Jesus because of his treatment of the people the Pharisees considered prodigals. Thus, they were putting themselves outside the Father's house. I don't even want to go in. Refusal to accept all those whom the Lord accepts is no small matter. It reveals our relationship to God himself, right? Now, the story could have ended here, but it doesn't. Jesus goes on to share with us what this father is going to plead with his son about. The father could have sent out a servant to order his son inside. I mean, he had the right to do that. But the father, who humbled himself to run to the returning prodigal, humbles himself to appeal to the angry older brother. It says he went out and he pleaded with him. His love for this son is no less profound than his love for his other son. He doesn't stand on his dignity, but he reveals his vulnerability. And the older son has only contempt for such a response. In the light of his father's appeal, the heart of the son is exposed. He speaks angry words that reveal who he really is. Now, in fact, we learn a lot about the older brother, and what we learn might explain why the younger brother wanted to go away to the far country. Because he kind of learned it from the older brother. Okay? The older brother has an attitude of contempt for his father. The look in verse 29 where he says, look, all my life, it has a sound of contempt in it. He hasn't stayed home because he loved his father, but because working in his fields, in his father's fields, was a way to get what he wanted. He shared his father's house, but not his father's heart. But despite his protesting, this man is more like his younger brother than he realized. He's full of concern for himself. He's intensely self-centered, and he's judging things only by how they satisfy his own interest. What a portrait of self-righteous and religious people. Morally respectable and publicly approved, such a person can be farther from God, the Father, than the prodigal in the pig pen. Right? Now, the Father's grace persists despite this outburst. A normal father would be furious at such an attack. Man, if my son had done that, and then I went out and begged and pleaded, and then he came back with those guys. Oh man! In my younger days, in my days before Jesus started, kind of helping knock the corners off, it would have been ugly. But this father's different. He explains carefully, and he says, in effect, "Don't you understand? We had to celebrate and be glad. We had no choice. Because of who I am, a father, I rejoice over lost sons who return." That's who I am. Joy is the only possibility. Joy is the only response. Joy is the only thing I can do. Not to rejoice would be to deny who I am. He is a gracious father who rejoices over children found. So, by the same token, the Father in heaven will not cancel the celebration. His heart aches too over the lost son, whether he's partying in the far country or working in the family's field, whether he's out doing drugs, whether he's doing a lifestyle that is not pleasing to God, doesn't make any difference. The godness of Jesus and the grace of God are the themes of this story, the deity of Jesus. There's a fascinating omission in the story. Do you see it? Do you see what was omitted there? What did Jesus leave out?
Well, at the end, it doesn't really say if the son changed his mind.
There's no ending. How would you like to go to a movie and you watch the movie and then you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Whoa, time out. What happened to this guy? What happened to this guy? Right? Movies always have an ending, but Jesus tells a parable that has no ending. Did the older brother enter or not? We're not told, because that's precisely the issue that Jesus sets before the Pharisees, and he sets it before us. To reject the Father's gracious treatment of the most unworthy of sinners is to deceive ourselves about our need for grace and to give up fellowship with God that's based on grace alone. You see, as long as the Pharisees stayed angry at the grace shown to the sinners, they stand outside the Father's house. Whoa. I was like, yeah. The bottom line is this. What we know of God is seen in how we view ourselves as lost and how we deal with others as lost. God's heart aches over those who are lost. God's heart rejoices over those who are found. How well we know him is revealed by whether or not we ache and rejoice as he does. Do we ache for that drug addict that we know is just jacking up his life? Do we ache for that individual that we know is beating his wife and we know that that's messing up his life? Do we ache for that individual whose lifestyles and choices we don't agree with, and we say biblically we disagree with that? Do we ache for them, or do we just go, they're weird? Okay? Think about that for a minute. How well we know God is revealed by whether or not we ache and we rejoice as he does. Okay. I got 3 minutes for questions. I blasted through that, so do what? You can take your first breath. Yeah. Well, I knew that was a lot, but I was like, you can't stop in the middle of this. That'd be like telling a parable and stopping without an ending, right? Go ahead.
You saying, do we ache for this person? Where I repeatedly always hit the wall on that, inside I ache and I'm like, man, this is going down a bad path. I've been down that path.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to go down there. I can tell you where it ends, but having been down that path, I can also tell you, unless you have awakened and said, what am I doing? Let me return. If you're still out there partying with the prostitutes and wild living or whatever, you haven't come to your senses, it doesn't matter if somebody whose heart aches says, let me tell you, this is leading no place good, because you're not in a place where you want to hear it, will listen to
Right.
it, and in fact, you're going to get really mad at them and
Exactly.
just cut them out.
Right.
Essentially. So what do you do? And that's not a 3-minute answer.
No,
that we can
but
solve here. But what do you do when somebody is in a place where they're fine where they're at?
Okay,
They don't
so look at what God did. God said, as the father, okay, this is what you want. Here's your inheritance. Now, it doesn't tell us, but we know God looked for him every day. In my head, that's God prayed for him. God was watching over him to say, man, I hope this one comes home. I hope this one comes home. That's right, every day. And so for us, I think the point to me was so that we don't get complacent and go, well, it's just okay. That's it. Yep, nothing you can do. Nothing you can do. No, we still have to have that aching heart. We still have to be ready to receive that individual. But you're right. It is their responsibility. They have to get to that place where they look in the mirror and they change their mind. Kendall, you were ready to make a comment there.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I've always wondered, like, if these three parables in succession is Jesus' wisdom in setting it all up in the mind of those he knew needed to hear it the most. Like, you know, the lost sheep is the fact that it's like, you know, hey, yeah, we've been out and found a lost sheep, and yeah, we're glad we found it, you know, and friends and neighbors come together, we're rejoicing.
Mhm.
How he says, you know what, God is rejoicing over those who, every righteous person who needed to repent.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, yeah. And it comes to the lost coin, you know, and they're going to rejoice in it. He says, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents. Yeah. You know, and then you get to the lost son, and they're like, whoa. You just have to wonder what's going through their mind. Like, are they thinking, like, well, if there's this person who's gone out and sinned like this, I don't know if I'd welcome them back.
Well, exactly, and there's a point in there where no doubt when Jesus told the part about he ended up with the pigs and eating the pods and all of that you could hear the Pharisees going, "That's right. That's what happens when you don't honor your father. That's what happens when you go out on your own. That's what happens when you go with the Gentiles." You can hear him saying that, and then Jesus said, but then he came to his senses and realized he had sinned against God. You know. And you're right. The Pharisees had to be like, whoa, now wait a minute, whoa, time out here. Something's not right here.
Maybe they're like, oh yeah, I can see that as a father. Maybe some of the Pharisees were like, hey, you know what? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yes, and we know that there were some Pharisees who understood Jesus' teaching and who agreed with it. We know that from Scripture. So yeah, but it's definitely an interesting take on that.
And the open-endedness at the end of the story, where it seems like, to me, it just lends itself to making application to yourself. As you pointed out, the idea of the parable is to help us to see ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
I know we're past the
That's okay.
mark, but something I had heard someone speak on this particular parable before, and they had pointed out at the end when this father is talking to the older brother is saying, when this son of yours comes back, but the father's response is, when this brother of yours
Yes.
returned. And I just thought that was interesting. The older brother, this son of yours, and the
Right.
father pleading, this brother of yours, not just this son of mine, this brother of
That's
yours.
a great point as well. All right, next week, loving my neighbor.
I got a question.
Sure.
If you went to a movie house, why would you go to a movie house? I never watched movies.
Okay.
I just believe, I have different beliefs.
Sure.
Why would you yourself go watch a movie?
Well, as a matter of fact, we went Friday night with some really good friends of ours. We were invited, and we went with them. So we went and watched Twisters on the big screen, so which is a good movie to watch when you're there.
I look at it just entertainment,
Yeah.
but he has a whole different view.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like anything else. It can be good and it can be bad. It can be good and it can be bad. The whole entertainment thing. Yeah, that's a whole path we can go down, and that's a whole Bible study in itself, Bob.
His background, he didn't grow up in that